Okay. Okay, Excellencies, good morning. So what I'm supposed to do here is to present the second ECA initiative. In the morning, we talked about the Sdg 7 initiative on how we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 7. And now I'm going to lay the ground on how we can achieve other SDGs. First of all, starting with SDG related to poverty. As you will hear from some of the numbers that I'm going to give you here, most of the African people are spending a significant amount of money out of their pockets to take care of their medication, especially to buy medicines. In fact, most families are usually one sickness away to fall back into poverty. So we can actually address this challenge and this vulnerability if it is possible for us to ensure they have access to safe and affordable medicines. The second thing is, in most of our African countries, we have medical supplies and medicines agencies. So every year, when the ministers of finance are preparing their budgets, they have to allocate resources to the ministries of health so that they can at least be able to procure medicines. Now, it turns out that for many of our countries, especially the small economies, it is very expensive because they do not have the scale, and so ministers of finance find themselves allocating a lot of money to procure medicines, something that can be addressed if you are able to lower the cost at which these medicines are procured. So there is a fiscal side to this question of pharmaceuticals. Now, the third thing is we have two continental frameworks. So you have heard about the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa, and you have heard about the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, the African Continental Free Trade Area is supposed to create one market and reduce all the barriers so that if you procure medicines in Ethiopia, or if you procure medicines in Rwanda or in Nigeria, that is treated as national product if you are to send it to another country. Now, for you to be able to do that, we have to bring down the barriers. That is what the AFCFTA is about. But you cannot also be able to do that unless you have ratified the AMA, and the AMA is in action because it is the one that is supposed to help us have a harmonized regulatory system so that not every government will not be asking for the registration of this particular drug or medicine in every jurisdiction because we have a harmonized system. So essentially this AFCFTA anchored pharma initiative is to demonstrate how we can use the AFCFTA because it's bringing down the barriers and also creating an opportunity for us to have harmonized regulations, to be able to operationalize the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa through scaling up of local production of pharmaceuticals so that we can at least be able to give access of medicines to our people. Now, the initiative as it stands now, we are focusing on 10 countries, and you'll see them in the brochures that we have given you there. And we hope that by demonstrating that it can be done in these 10 countries, we will be able to scale it up continentally. And by the time we do this, hopefully we'll have achieved, Commissioner, all the ratifications we need, and we'll already have started the regulatory harmonization that is spearheaded by AMA. So at the macro level, just to repeat, we import 70% of our pharmaceutical products as Africa. Only 2% of what we need is what is produced in the continent. So there is a potential here for us to do more. Now, medicines also consume a large proportion of the healthcare budget. In fact, at the moment, we are looking at importation of more than $14 billion worth of medicines from outside the continent. Now, the total spending on healthcare in Africa has remained at around 5 to 6% of our GDP. And like I said, for most countries, the out-of-pocket expenditures for health spending for families is up to 32%. Now, we do have an interesting example from Rwanda, whereby the out-of-pocket expenditure has actually come down to 6%, and we would want to understand how can we bring the 32% down to where Rwanda is, because like I have said, if we do that, we'll actually be able to save money for families and also have governments have extra resources so that they can expand health facilities. Now, our moderator did indicate that there are business opportunities. In fact, the projection is that by 2030, wellness alone and health will give us, will be worth about 259 billion. And so the private sector has an opportunity to be a player in this. Now, why is it that we are talking about the private sector? Because since 2000 to 2017, the debt to GDP ratio of our countries has been rising. In fact, it has risen by about 15 percentage points. And so it is actually starting to put pressure on governments when it comes to their ability to provide quality health, expand education, build infrastructure, provide security. So the governments cannot actually be able to finance the gap of 66 billion that is required annually in the health sector unless you are to bring the private sector on board. And of course, one component of that is we have decided how do we demonstrate that you can actually use the AFCFTA at least to save the money under the health sector, under the pharmaceutical side. So let me give you then some examples of what is happening in the countries that we are visiting. So in the 10 countries, that is, you have them there, Seychelles, Madagascar, Comoros, Djibouti. If you have not seen them, you'll see them in your brochure. In these 10 countries, the pharmaceutical import bill is about 2.6% of total imports. The health financing gap in these countries is about 3.2% of GDP. So you can do the maths. So like an economy like this, if you have to use, which is a $100 billion economy, so if you have to look at 3% of that, it's a huge amount of money that Ethiopia needs if it is to meet the gap of health financing. Now, and I said that the out-of-pocket expenditure for these countries, they are almost equal to where the African average is of 35%. Now, on the fiscal side for these countries, it is actually challenging for them because besides the situation they are having now, they are also experiencing some transitions. So you see the non-communicable diseases are increasing, which is making it much more costlier to provide health, good and quality health. And also because they are small markets, they are having difficulties to procure medicines at cheap prices. So in our case study, we looked at what has been happening in Eastern Caribbean, and we found out that in the Eastern Caribbean, for 12 island states with a total population of 500,000 people, through pooled procurement, they were able to observe a drop of 45% in terms of the cost of the medicines for their people. So the thing is, if you can imagine how we can use pooled procurement, because now we have the AFCFTA, to bring down the cost to what the Eastern Caribbean have done, you can actually see the amount of resources that can actually be released at the family level and also at the government level. So this AFCFTA anchored farmer initiative, it's not just a health initiative, it's an economic initiative, it's a jobs initiative, because also the pharmaceutical sector has a huge potential for jobs for the young people. especially if we see an expansion of the pharmaceutical industries that are currently existing in the continent, or an attraction of new investments for new pharmaceutical industries, because we have been able to demonstrate that there is scale on the demand side, and what we need now is the supply. And to conclude, it is possible also to use this pharmaceutical initiative in realizing the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa to actually create the regional value chains that we think are so essential if Africa is actually to increase the proportion of medicines that are being produced in the continent. So in addition to having pool procurement of finished medicines or ready medicines, we can actually be able to create a pool procurement of the ingredients for our pharmaceutical manufacturing, because we'll actually have a regional value chain all the way from the design of the drugs to the supply of the drugs, including the manufacturing. So thank you very much for your attention, and we hope to hear some ideas from you of what is happening in the institutions and the countries that you represent here. Thank you.